Today, we are going to discuss another question asked as Meta. The question goes as like following. You are a PM at Meta. Build product for home emergencies. Before starting into answering the question, we'll ask a couple of clarifying questions. The first question will be Meta now has multiple consumer facing products, which is WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook. Which product shall we focus upon? Let's say the integer comments, we can choose WhatsApp. The second question will be that how exactly do we define a home emergency? The response that comes to us is any incident which happens in the residential premise and can result into serious or fatal injuries, which could be, let's say, a fire incident, a fractured arm, or a cardiac arrest. Now, with these clarifying questions, we move ahead and try and basically define that what are the role which our app or our product has to play during home emergencies. So, in order to understand a home emergency, there are three major parts of it. The first is detection of home emergency. Now, this is like say all about when an incident happens, how can we detect it proactively and then start reporting it. But for any kind of a detection which has to happen, you need to have some kind of control over the hardware. But since you have chosen a consumer app, which is WhatsApp, right now this control of hardware is something which is not possible out of the box, and hence detection of any home emergency is something which we will keep out of scope. The second part is the dissemination of information. That is, once you have understood that a incident has happened, how do you share the information with the right stakeholders? Now, this is something like which can be enabled via presence of both hardware and software, because software alone cannot do anything. Software has to be embedded, let's say, in some hardwares, and hence this specific section is one place where we can actually make some difference with the help of WhatsApp. The third part is that once you have informed about an incident like which has happened, how do you do the entire disaster management? Now, this is also something like which can be achieved by a combination of a hardware and a software, and hence this is also something which we will take under consideration while designing our product. To summarize, we are keeping the detection part out of it, but we are going to focus upon the dissemination of information and disaster management aspects of handling home emergencies. Before designing the product, let's also understand that what are the user segments that we have and what are the pain points that we need to address. First, we will focus upon the user segments. And the first point actually which comes into picture is that do I need to define my user segments based upon any kind of criteria such as power users, non-power users, age of the users or gender of the users? The answer is simply no, because home emergency can actually happen to anyone and anybody, and hence we should not limit our feature to a specific gender, specific age, or a specific section of our users. In fact, we should even go ahead and say all of the users who are using WhatsApp are actually my target groups. We should even go ahead and say that anybody who is not using a WhatsApp shall also be considered as one of the user segments of this particular product. Now let's probably spend a minute to understand that what is this aspect. Let's say there's a home emergency which is happening, and at home there is a child and his father is actually there. Now the father has actually suffered a fatal injury. Now the child, who is probably, let's say, 10 years old, might not be a direct user of WhatsApp, but he can use our product to report the incident of injury that has happened to his father. So far, we have focused upon the consumer facing side of it, but there's also one very important stakeholder that we might miss out. So we should also take into consideration that any disaster management team which is responsible for hearing out any incidences that are happening and responding accordingly should also be, let's say, a very, very important user segment for us. Once we have finalized the user segments, let's also understand what are the different pain points that we need to address. The first pain point is that, like, whenever an incident happens, how do I do an effective first instance and detailed reporting about the incident? The second important part is that once an incident has actually happened and once a reporting has also been done, how do I follow up so that the response from the disaster management team is timely coming up, and in case there are any delays, I end up doing some follow. Now, the third important thing is this is going to be, let's say, such a critical feature, and definitely the amount of resources which are available to us to respond to the disasters across, let's say, a geography are going to be limited. So how do I ensure that I'm not making this feature so widespread that it starts actually getting, let's say, misuse? So how do I focus upon the misuse of the specific feature so that available resources only goes to the people who are in real need of them? The last part is all about that, like whenever a disaster management happens, how can I actually do my entire resource allocation more and more effectively? In the next section, let's focus upon some of the high level workflows that we will actually focus upon. We'll try and cover a gist of what our workflow actually requires for us to be built and what is the scope of that specific workflow. First thing, definitely that we want to focus upon is the signups. Now, why sign up is something like which is a very, very important and let's say workflow for us to build is that when any kind of an incident happens, we would actually want to give as much information as to the disaster management team so that they can prepare accordingly. And some of the very critical information that will actually come handy to the disaster management teams is actually going to be following, right? That do I know that who is the person who has actually met the emergency, right? Where does the person actually lives in? What is the age of the person, what is the blood group of the person, and is the person allergic to certain kind of, let's say, medicines or certain kind of situations. So this really helps us in gathering all of the necessary information which might come handy to the disaster management team while handling the emergencies. The second part is the incident reporting itself. Now in the incident reporting also, we have to be, let's say, focused upon two specific scenario. One scenario where the person is in a situation to provide as detailed information as he can so that the disaster management team can be well prepared about the entire incident. And second part could be about like a very, very brief reporting. Let's say I was alone at my home and I met some kind of a emergency and I'm not, let's say, even in a situation to respond, let's say, in a very, very detailed manner. So how do I do a very brief reporting? Here, what we can suggest is that there's one very important aspect that we can include is basically voice-based reporting. So let's say you're not in a state to go through an entire workflow on a UI. So you have a simple option, let's say on your app, where upon clicking, you are recording a voice message, maybe a very short one. And this voice message is something like which is directly going to the disaster management teams. The third very important thing is that, say, how do I basically limit my false positives or how do I basically prevent my misuses? Wherein our approach will be that the number of times like a person can actually use the app, if we can actually limit the same, which means we can allow emergency credits to each and every users, and these credits are not going to be unlimited. These credits are going to be, let's say, limited in number, right? And in case, let's say, someone tries to misuse this, we basically ensure that these credits are actually locked. And whenever like there's an actual incident which happens and somebody uses the credits, we try and basically go and refresh that credit after the incident reporting and incident response has actually been done. Now, the fourth important part of it is that, like, say, how do I use this entire feature or how do I make this entire feature more and more useful for the disaster management teams, which then can use this entire feature for their monitoring and planning purposes. The first thing that like we would actually want to build is like the follow-up workflow, which is going to be, let's say, more both on the user side as well as on the disaster management team side, which means that as and when an incident gets reported, if there's no acknowledgement, if there's no response for the incidents like in some period of time, there's a follow-up like which goes up. There's a follow-up like which goes up automatically both from the consumers and also, let's say, within the disaster management teams. And there's a escalation workflow through which this particular follow-up chain actually goes through. The second important part where it could actually be used is the entire resource planning, because now a lot of this information which is going to come from users that such an home emergency happen are going to be digital in nature, let's say from the very, very onset. So how do I basically use this data to do an effective resource planning? Right? Let's say, how do I understand that like in what regions my resources are deployed as compared to what is the quantum of emergency which are coming from those regions? And accordingly, I can understand if my resource deployment is actually correct or not. Do I need to rejig it? Or I can even understand if I need to basically hire, let's say, more and more resources onto my platform. The second thing where it could actually be, let's say, very, very helpful is basically policy changes. Now, you not only have the incidents getting reported, but since they are digital, it is also possible to classify these incidences. For an example, if a lot of home emergencies are coming due to, let's say, fire happening in certain kind of electronic device at home, what we can also do and understand is that how that device is actually manufactured and are there any extra safety guardrails that we need to put around that specific device, which could be then asked from the manufacturers as part of any kind of a manufacturing policy changes that we want. We have understood that what particular meta app are we going to use, how we are going to use it, for what actions are we actually going to use it. Let's also understand that like once the entire feature or once the entire workflow gets ready, how are we going to measure the success for the same. So we are going to measure the success, let's say, in three parts. The first thing that we are going to measure is that about how many people are even aware about the specific functionality that we have built and how many signups have actually happened on them. So awareness is something which we are going to understand via the proxy of signups, which basically tells us that approximately in a given range, how many absolute number of signups are actually happening and what is the sign up growth looking like. So there's also a possibility that let's say that the feature becomes very, very powerful. Ideally, the sign up growth is going to plateau after a certain point in time because you can only sign up as many people who are the users of WhatsApp. Right. So the third thing that we are going to measure, which will basically help us understand if the sign up growth rate is something which is healthy also or not, is the percentage of signups which are actually happening against the WhatsApp users. If this number, which is the signups per WhatsApp users, is something which is very high, then we can assume that the second metric, which is sign up growth, is actually going to plateau no matter what. The second thing that we are going to focus upon is basically the adoption. That when an actual incident happens, how many times people are even using our application, because that is something which also tells us that people are able to recall this specific product that we have built when an actual incident of the sort happens. Right. We are going to measure it as the total amount of incidents that are reported divided by the actual incidences, right? So relatively lower number of reported incidents divided by actual incidents is going to tell us is that even though we might have a lot of signups, let's say, on our application, but whenever an actual incident happens, people are not recalling our product at the very, very first. But if this number is something like which is on the higher side, let's say 60% and above, 50% and above, then what we can assume is that whenever such incidents happens, people are well aware about our product and they are using our product to detect the emergency. The third thing that we're actually going to focus upon is that what is the overall efficacy of the product. Because so far you have actually created a lot of awareness so that whenever incident happens, people are adopting for your workflow, but all of the things are not going to help unless your product is something which is very, very effective. And this is where the trust factor starts coming in. So from an efficacy point of view, what would actually want to understand is that out of the total number of incidents, let's say, which are reported, how many of them were actually resolved? So a very high percentage will actually help us understand that the channel is something like which is effective. That is, whenever you report an incident, there's a high likelihood that the incident actually gets resolved, but a lower number kind of understands that there is still a lot of work which needs to be done on the entire set of a workflow, because our reporting is not leading to a resolution, which is not only, let's say, breaking the trust of the users, but it could also turn out to be, let's say, very, very, very fatal for the users.